The Holy Grail, the Cathars, and Dante. In this period, the saga of the Holy Grail was born. The creator of the Grail was Cercando de Troyes. In his romance Percival and the Story of the Grail, written between 1180 and 1190 in the oil language, appears this word for the first time that simply means cup, even if it is anything but a simple cup. It is golden, studded with precious stones, and emanates an intense, mysterious light. Only towards the end of the romance will we find out that the cup, that is the Grail, contains a consecrated host that has the power to heal. Cercando de Troyes dies before finishing his romance. This has given the cue to several authors to elaborate not just different endings, but numerous variants, of which the most important is that of Robert the Baron, who brought the magician Merlin into the story, and King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. A little as they do today with successful films, this was done back then to something that could be defined as a medieval soap opera. Page 142. Already in the Percival of Cercando de Troyes, the reference to the Eucharist is evident, and this will be the element most stressed in the later variants. The Grail will be transformed and will be identified with the cup of the Last Supper, in which the blood of Christ was caught, a cup about which there was not a trace in the Gospels. Here it is appropriate to make a small historical consideration. In the Middle Ages, in the years at the turn of the 13th century of which we are speaking, not only had printing not been invented yet, but not even paper had been invented. One wrote exclusively on parchment and by hand, by which the book was very costly, both for who acquired it and who produced it. This is the point. Who produced books? Or better, who would have the interest to do it? The centres of power. In general, the authors, as in the case of Cercando de Troyes, were moving to live at the courts of the commissioning ruler or feudal lord, who demanded that his own ideas be circulated, as, moreover, editors still do today. These were the relationships that existed between the authors and their works. That said, two are the political manoeuvres that we can catch sight of behind this most costly profusion of Grail romances. The first identifies the ruling house of the Plantagenets as the instigators. It's an interesting case, but can only apply to Cercando de Troyes, and above all for his poem Lancelot, that he wrote while living at the court of Henry II, and not for the following series. The second explains perfectly not only why these romances were written, but also and above all the extravagant circumstances in which they were written. All in the span of 50 years, from 1180 to 1230. From that date, no more were written. Why? The answer is all too simple, because whoever financed them had no more interest to do it. Okay, but why? And why exactly in 1230? Analysing the romances, we can see that there are always two elements present in all the variants, that of the Eucharist and that of chivalry. Let's leave aside for a moment the part where the Eucharist is the fundamental reason that I speak of here. The romances are a hymn to the figure of the knight. Now the crusade, page 143, against Occitan Catharism was entrusted to the knights applauded in these romances. And I would like to point out that the romances were written in the oil language, the language of northern France, from which, as it happens, came the knights who took part in the crusade. But in 1229, the Holy See sent the knights home and instituted a new system of repression for the Cathars, the Inquisition, starting in 1231. So just around 1230, the Church would have no more need of romances that extol the knights. The dates correspond too precisely to simply be coincidences. So, to have promoted and diffused these romances is without doubt the Church, who had the means to do it and all the interest. At this point it becomes clear that the entire Grail cycle had been written, as claimed in no uncertain terms by Michel Roquebert in his anti-Cathar function, that is, to dispute Catharism. And these two fronts, that is, Eucharistic and chivalrous, had the intent to entice the knights in the north to follow the example of the glorious knights of the Grail, and so participate in the crusade against the Cathar deniers of the sacredness of the host. For about a century there were those who had linked the Holy Grail precisely to the Cathars, with the treasure of the Cathars. It's pure invention that has no historical base at all. Catharism developed in the region in which the Oc language was spoken, that had its own literature, the poetry of the troubadours, in which never appeared, not even once, a hint of the Grail, as it did not appear in Dante, who did however cite from these romances. One day, to pass the time away, we read of Lancelot, how love had overcome him. Hell 5, 127 to 128. Paolo and Francesca read one of the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, the Book of Galaho, by which they allowed themselves to be captivated and brought them to perdition. In a clear and certainly intentional contraposition with the final verses of the Canto of the Lustful in Hell, the Damned, one can read about those in the Canto of the Lustful in Purgatory, the Saved, where Dante puts in the mouth of the great troubadour Arnaud Daniel 8 verses in the Oc language, while the Book of Galaho was in the Oil language. Of him he says that, page 144, he surpassed all those who wrote their poems of love or prose romances. But Arnaud Daniel had never written romances. As all the commentators say, Dante refers here to the only romances of the time, those of the Holy Grail. So, somewhat through the lines, Dante indicates what is, to his mind, good literature and what isn't. Dante lived in those years, breathed in that atmosphere, and had his finger very much on the pulse. We have forgotten it. Dante knew it, but he couldn't express it with the clarity that I can today, because he was on the side of the defeated, and the battle was still in progress. The Inquisition had operated against the Cathars for all of the 14th century. I have no doubts the Grail was holy and sacred only for the victor's culture, not for that of the defeated, not for the Cathars, not for Dante.